Hi, and welcome back. So here, let's go ahead and implement the account number, the first name and the last name. And just as a reminder, this is where we kind of left things off, right? We had our time zone class, and then we also had the beginning of our account class. So now we really need to take this and start adding to it. So I'm going to delete it from here, and I'm going to add it down here, and let's go ahead and start implementing the rest of our functionality. So we'll need the init, and we'll pass in the account number. Remember I said that we can assume it's going to get passed in, and then we're also going to require the first name and the last name to be passed in when the account is created, but we'll also allow those to be modified after the fact, but we won't allow the account number to be modified. So in practice, you probably want to add some checks here, make sure that, maybe the first name isn't empty, the last name isn't empty. Maybe your account number needs to satisfy certain requirements, length requirements, maybe, I don't know, whatever it is. I'm going to omit a lot of those checks. And for now, let's just go ahead and store these values as simple instance attributes, but we'll indicate that they should be private attributes. So self. Now, I'm going to use properties for first name and last name. So here, I'm not going to use the underscore. I'm going to use self.firstName equals first name and self.lastName equals last name. So we could leave it at that. We could leave them as bare attributes. But I do want to add some validation on the first name and the last name. So I'm going to use properties to do that. I'm going to use basically getters and setters for first name and last name. So let's go ahead and do that. And I am going to make a read-only property for the account number. So let's put that in. So property def account number. And then all we do here is just return self._account number. We'll just return the private value. Next, I want to specify now the property for first name. So let's go ahead and create a property. We'll define the getter first because I'm using the decorator syntax. And so we'll just return self._first name. And next, I'm going to set the setter for the first name property. So self and value, right? So we're going to get a value passed in. And here, I do want to make some small validation. All I'm going to do here is I'm going to say if length, take the string of whatever value is that gets passed in, strip it, and if that length is equal to 0, right, then I'm going to raise a value error, and we'll say first name cannot be empty. Okay, so we'll do it this way. And if it passes, then we haven't raised an error, and at that point, I can go ahead and set first name equal to value. Okay. And now I'm going to do the same thing with the last name. So let's go ahead and property def last name self return self._last name. Okay. So I'm basically following exactly what I did for the first name. So now we have the last name setter. So def last name. Remember that the name of the function and the name of the property must match, right? Otherwise, you're going to end up with a property name that's now this name, whatever this name is. And of course, we want to keep it the same in this case. So we'll have self and value. And again, I'm going to do the same kind of validation. So I'm just going to copy paste this validation code. So, as soon as you start copy pasting code that's identical, you should be thinking in yourself, is that right? Can I maybe abstract this out? Can I refactor this so I don't have to type the same code twice, right? In this case, it was only 2 lines of code. But what if my validation had been 20 lines of code? Then I would have to repeat these 20 lines of code in 2 cases. The only difference here is that the error message, I want it to be last name cannot be empty. And then what happens after that? Well, of course, that's different. I'm going to store it in the last name property, right? But I have some code redundancy here. So this would work. This would be fine. But as I mentioned, I do not like having this code repeated twice, right? Here and here. So we need to have a better approach to this. So I'm going to move the validation to a separate function, because really, if you think, it's doing the same validation. And in general, whatever validation I do for the first name is probably going to be the same as for the last name. So I'm going to move this validation into a separate function. Now, what should that function be? Well, let's go ahead and write it. Let's see. I'm going to call it def validate name. So I'm going to validate a name here, and I want to specify the value that I want to validate. The other thing too that I'm going to specify is the field title, like first name, last name, right? That's my field title. I know that that's going to change, and I do want to pass it in because I want my error messages to be a little more specific. So I'm going to do that. I could certainly, skip that and just return a generic message saying, field cannot be empty, but that's not very nice for our users. It'd be nice if we can tell them the first name field cannot be empty, right? So that's the first thing. And then, of course, if this is right now an instance method, we need the self as well. So let's go ahead and write this function. So we'll say if length, and basically it's going to be whatever validation I want to do that's common to both, right? And in this case, it's just what I had before. So if that length is 0, then I'm going to raise a value error. And I'll say here that the field title cannot be empty. Okay? And I'll raise that error. Otherwise, I'm going to return, well, what am I going to return? I'm actually going to normalize the value. So I'm actually going to take the value and strip it. So I might as well clean it up as well while I'm here. So if somebody passes in a name with an extra space in front or at the end, I'm just going to strip it out and ignore it. Okay, so this looks good, but you'll notice one thing. I'm not using anything from the instance in this code. I don't really need this self over here. So this is actually a static method. This is where I can make this into a static method. Right? And I don't need the instance. So now, of course, I've got to change my validation up here because I'm still doing the validation like that over here. So what am I going to do here? Well, this method, right, the static method returns the value if it's correct. Otherwise, it's going to raise the value error. So over here, all I really need to do is to say self.firstName is equal to, well, underscore first name is equal to validate name. And I'll pass it the value, and I'll pass it the title that I want, which is first name, like so. And then I can do the same thing in the setter over here for the last name. Basically, it's equal to validate name, and I'll pass it value and last name. Okay, so this is almost correct. What is validate name? Where is it living? Well, it's living in my class, right? So I can't just call it validate name. I need to tell it where it's living. Now, I could certainly use self. That would work. I don't recommend doing that because then people might think, oh, this is, an instance method. So you could, that would work just as well. I'm just actually going to use the class, right? So at least the person seeing this realizes that, okay, this is not an instance method. It may be a class method. It's not. In this case, it's a static method. But at least, there's some indication that this isn't a standard instance method. So I'm going to use this, like so. Okay, so let's go ahead and try it out. So we can do a try, and we'll set up an account. And we'll say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for the account number. And then the name is going to be, let's say, John. And then the last name, I'm going to pass that as an empty string. And we should expect to see a value error. And let's go ahead, trap just the value errors, and let's see what we get. And indeed, we trap that, and we get the message, last name cannot be empty. If I do none, I get nothing. What happened here? Well, let's go back and look at our validation code over here. How is it working? Well, right now it's saying if the length of the string stripped is 0. Okay, what is the string of none? If you don't know that, here it is. It's the string none. So in fact, if I looked at my account last name over here, and let's go ahead and print it, you'll see the account last name is none. All right, so we need to fix that, right? Now again, this is where unit testing would come in handy, because we can write those tests that are going to test those kinds of edge conditions, and it will catch those kinds of errors. We don't have to do it manually every time, because every time we change the code, we really have to rerun all our tests, right? Okay, so let me go ahead here and fix this up. So I'm going to say if value is none, or that cannot be empty, okay? And now we get last name cannot be empty. All right, so this would work just fine, but I want to show you a little tweak that we can make, and I'll probably keep that tweak, but I want to show you at least where we might use something like the set attribute function, the set adder function that we've seen, because I've showed you that in the lectures and we saw that in the code sections, but it really becomes useful when we want to set attribute values based on the attribute name that we have as a string, right? So let me go ahead and show you this. So let's go back, let's take this code and we're going to modify it. So I'm going to copy it, let's paste it down here, and I'm going to do something a little bit different. What I'm going to do is I'm not going to make a static method now, I am going to make an instance method, okay? And so I need to pass in the self. But the other thing I'm going to pass in to that method is going to be the actual property name, right? The property name that I want to set, right, this value into. So, or if you want, think of it as the attribute name. So maybe attribute name would be better here. So this is going to be the attribute name, the value, and the field title. And what do I want to do? Well, I want to do my validation, right? So if value is none or blah, 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 then raise the value error. If it's not, if it's passed, I'm just going to store the data. Now, I cannot use self.attribute name equals, right? Because attribute name is a string. That's not going to work. But instead, I can use set attribute function. So I can set the attribute on myself. I can set the attribute name to the value that was passed in. Okay, and now I'm not going to call this validate name. I'm going to call it validate and set name. So now we need to modify how we're storing the values. So here I was using the account validate name. Well, first of all, now it's going to be an instance method. So it's going to be self dot, and it's called validate and set name. And I'm not getting a return value out of it. So I'm just going to call this method, but I need to tell it which attribute to store the value in. So that's all I need to do here is just say, I want to store that in the underscore first name attribute of my instance. And then I want to do the same thing over here. So again, this is going to be self, validate, and set name. And then here I want to put it into the last name attribute. Okay. So you notice how I was able to pass in the attribute name as a string because I know what it is. Inside this last name method, I know what my attribute, my underlying storage name is, right? So I'm passing it as a string, and so this is why I have to use the set attribute function because I have the attribute name as a string. Okay, so now let's go ahead and try it out. So first of all, let's just make sure that we get our exceptions as expected. So let's say I have this, and we should get an exception that the names cannot be empty. And of course, it checks the first name first, so that should be the one that we get. And indeed, we get that the first name cannot be empty. Now let's go ahead and create an account with valid data. So let's say Alex Martelli. And now I should be able to look at first name. Great. I should be able to look at last name. Okay, great as well. So that's all working properly. And if I set a first name equal to A, let's say, then you'll see that if I look at a dot first name, it was set correctly as well. All right, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.